The little village of St. Mildred's, on the green, was the sort of place where even the wind seemed to move politely. Narrow lanes wove like pale ribbons between thatched cottages, every garden spilling over with roses and hollyhocks. The church bells chimed each quarter hour, and the postmistress knew more secrets than the parish register itself. It was, in short, a village where nothing dreadful ever happened, or so people liked to believe. Miss Jane Marple had come to St. Mildred's to visit her old friend, Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt, a widow of some years who occupied a charming ivy-covered house called Beechwood Cottage. Lavinia was the sort of woman who filled her life with committees, church teas, and charitable causes, to keep one's mind active, as she liked to say. On that particular morning, the village seemed especially serene. The air was crisp with the scent of cut grass, and a faint mist lingered over the churchyard. Miss Marple sat by the parlour window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, as Lavinia busied herself arranging a vase of chrysanthemums. "I do think autumn is the most deceptive season," Miss Marple said, peering through her spectacles. "Everything appears so tranquil, and yet it's a time of decay. Rather like human nature, don't you think, Lavinia?" Lavinia smiled absently. "Oh, Jane, you do have such a morbid way of looking at things. I prefer to see it as a time of preparation, for renewal, you know." Miss Marple murmured. "That depends entirely on whether one survives the winter." Before Lavinia could reply, the brass door knocker rattled with the enthusiasm only village postmen possess. Moments later, Mr. Peter Finch, the local postman and part-time gossipmonger, appeared with a letter in his hand. "Morning, Mrs. Harcourt." "Morning, Miss Marple. Bit of excitement this morning, what?" he said, his ruddy face shining with curiosity. "There's been an accident up at Greystone Manor." Lavinia's eyes widened. "An accident? Good heavens, what sort?" "Well, the doctor's been sent for," Finch replied, lowering his voice theatrically. "They say Mr. Lionel Drake is dead. The death at Greystone Manor now." Greystone Manor stood on the edge of the village, a grand but melancholy house of grey stone and darker history. Its master, Lionel Drake, was a retired colonel with a reputation for severity, and an unfortunate fondness for port. He had returned to the village 3 years ago after his wife's death abroad, bringing with him his young niece, Clara Drake, whom he was said to treat more like an inconvenience than a ward. Within the hour, St. Mildred's buzzed with whispers. "A heart attack, they say. Or perhaps a fall. He was found near the staircase. I shouldn't be surprised if it was something more sinister. You know what tempers military men have." Miss Marple listened quietly to the speculation as Lavinia poured tea. "One must never underestimate the human element," she said softly. "Accidents, I find, are rarely as accidental as they appear." By afternoon, word arrived that the police had indeed been summoned. The local constable, Sergeant Reeves, a sturdy man with a deep respect for Miss Marple's intelligence, born of prior humiliations, paid a polite call. "Just routine, Miss Marple," he said, hat in hand. "Colonel Drake was found dead in his study. Dr. Pembroke believes it may have been heart failure, but the coroner will have to confirm." "Still, there are circumstances." "Circumstances," Miss Marple repeated mildly. "Yes, ma'am. A glass of brandy was found near him, untouched, and a letter half burned in the fireplace. Looked like he was in the middle of writing something when it happened." "Half-burned letters," Miss Marple said, "are most inconvenient for truth-seeking, don't you agree, Sergeant?" He grinned sheepishly. "Indeed, ma'am. The doctor says he's writing to his solicitor about his will, but we've yet to confirm." The residents of Greystone Manor. By the next day, the village curiosity reached a fever pitch. Lavinia, ever the social butterfly, insisted on calling at Greystone Manor under the pretext of bringing flowers. Miss Marple accompanied her, more from quiet interest than propriety. The household was a sombre one. The tall butler, Mr. Hargreaves, admitted them with the air of a man attending his own funeral. In the drawing-room stood Clara Drake, a pale young woman of about 24, with dark eyes and nervous hands. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Harcourt," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Uncle Lionel was... well, it was so sudden. He'd been quite himself at breakfast." Miss Marple studied the girl's expression. The darting eyes, the faint swelling around the lids from tears that were not entirely fresh. She noted also the faint scent of lavender, the kind not sold in village shops. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you must have had quite a shock." "Yes," Clara murmured. "He was found by the housekeeper. Poor Mrs. Griggs. She said he looked as though he'd seen a ghost." A curious phrase, Miss Marple thought. At that moment, another figure entered. A tall, angular woman in widow's weeds. "Ah, visitors," she said in a tone of faint annoyance. "I am Mrs. Judith Blackwood, Mr. Drake's sister. You must forgive the household. Everything is quite unsettled." Miss Marple recognized the type immediately. Proud, self-contained, with a mind that brooked no interference. Yet something in the set of Mrs. Blackwood's jaw suggested a deeper unease. A village divided by gossip by evening, the village inn, the Stag and Lantern, was overflowing with theories. "Poison, I tell you," declared Mr. Huggins, the blacksmith. "Drake was a hard man, made enemies. I heard he sacked his gardener without notice last month." "Nonsense," replied Mrs. Finch, the postman's wife. "It was heart failure. Men of his age shouldn't argue after supper. My brother-in-law dropped dead after a game of whist." But Miss Marple, who sat quietly sipping her tea in the corner, knew gossip often contained a grain of truth and a pound of distortion. Later that night, as the rain tapped against her window, she reflected on what she had observed: the niece's nervousness, the sister's cold control, and the curious absence of grief among the servants. And always, she thought, there was the unfinished letter. She smiled faintly to herself. "Human nature," she murmured, "is infinitely consistent, especially in its inconsistencies." An unexpected confession 2 days later. The inquest was held in the village hall. Dr. Pembroke gave his findings: death from heart failure, precipitated by extreme stress. No trace of poison. The coroner nodded, ready to close the matter, when a trembling voice interrupted. It was Clara Drake. I must say something," she stammered. "Uncle Lionel didn't die of heart failure. He was frightened. He told me the night before that he'd discovered something terrible." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The coroner frowned. "My dear young lady, unless you have specific evidence." "I don't," Clara said desperately. "But I know someone was in the house that night who shouldn't have been." "I heard voices in the study," he said. "If this gets out, someone will hang." The room erupted into whispers. Miss Marple watched Clara closely. The panic in her eyes was genuine, but there was also something rehearsed, as though she were repeating a line from memory rather than conviction. After the proceedings, Sergeant Reeves muttered, "I suppose that puts us back at square one." "Not quite," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "It puts us at the beginning, where all proper investigations should start." The shadows of Greystone. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone to the manor. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke, and a crow watched her from a bare branch as she approached the gates. Mr. Hargreaves, the butler, looked startled to see her. "I've come to pay my respects," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "And perhaps, if I might, to see where poor Colonel Drake passed away. I do so find that places speak volumes." The study was a large, oak-paneled room, dimly lit and heavy with the scent of tobacco. A single chair had been righted, the one in which the colonel had sat, and the fire was cold. On the desk lay an empty brandy decanter, a scorched patch of carpet near the hearth, and the remnants of a half-burnt envelope. Miss Marple bent down delicately. "How curious," she murmured. "The edges are burnt inward, as though someone burned it hastily, not by accident." She examined the decanter next. The stopper was slightly off-center, and the glass smudged. To most eyes, unremarkable. But Miss Marple's sharp mind noted every incongruity. Turning toward the window, she saw footprints on the sill, small, muddy and faint. A woman's perhaps, or a servant's. "Very interesting," she said softly. Tea and truths. When she returned to Beechwood Cottage, Lavinia was entertaining the vicar's wife, Mrs. Denby, who was already halfway through a lemon sponge and an account of her husband's new sermon. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Denby said, "such dreadful business! Though of course, these things are often providential. I dare say the colonel's passing has spared some poor soul a lifetime of misery. He was not, shall we say, universally beloved." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, indeed. Sometimes a death can be a kind of salvation, for others, and perhaps even for the one who dies." "Goodness, that sounds quite theological," Lavinia said, refilling her cup. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "Just observation. A name half burnt that evening." Sergeant Reeves appeared again, hat in hand. "Miss Marple, you've got quite the eye, so I thought you'd like to know. We found something new. That letter in the fireplace, the one that was half burnt. We managed to piece together a few words." "Oh, yes, ma'am. It mentions someone by name. Hard to make out the whole thing, but it reads, 'Cannot allow Clara to know the truth. It would destroy her.' As for Blackwood, that's all we've got." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained calm. As for Blackwood, she repeated, that could mean his sister, or something else entirely. Tell me, Sergeant, did you notice whether the decanter on his desk was recently cleaned? Reeves blinked. Can't say I did. Why? Oh, no reason, she said mildly. Only that people who die suddenly often leave behind more questions than corpses. A whisper of guilt. That night, Miss Marple sat up late in her room, knitting half forgotten on her lap. Her mind was busy assembling fragments. A niece's fear, a sister's control, a letter burned in haste, and a glass of brandy never drunk. She recalled something the housekeeper, Mrs. Griggs, had said in passing that afternoon. The Colonel was angry last night, miss. Shouting he was. Said someone had betrayed him. Betrayal, Miss Marple thought, was one of those words that seldom came without a corpse following close behind. Outside, the church clock struck 11. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. And then, faintly, from the direction of Greystone Manor, came the echo of hurried footsteps, followed by the slam of a carriage door. Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed. Ah, she said softly, the play is still in its first act. The following morning dawned bleak and misty, with a faint drizzle that painted the village in shades of silver, grey. The church bell tolled 8, and the sleepy rhythm of village life resumed, milk delivered, chimneys puffing, and curtains drawn back to the damp world beyond. Miss Marple was already awake, her breakfast tray balanced neatly on her knees, a pot of tea, a slice of toast, and the morning newspaper, folded precisely in half, accompanied her sharp, thoughtful eyes. She had slept little. The image of Colonel Drake's study, the brandy glass, the burned letter, and the frightened niece, had occupied her mind like a puzzle missing its central piece. She read the newspaper headline aloud. Sud dimmed lo filial ruraret officia, half iris us petid, heart failure. Miss Marple murmured, how convenient. Lavinia Harcourt bustled in moments later, her face glowing with both concern and curiosity. Jane, my dear, have you heard? They're saying Clara Drake may be leaving the Manor for London. So soon after her uncle's passing? Miss Marple looked up sharply. Indeed. And who, may I ask, is managing the estate now? Why, Mrs. Blackwood, of course. The sister. She's taken charge of all arrangements. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Yes, she said quietly. I rather thought she would. At the Manor once more by mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself once again at Greystone Manor. She had telephoned ahead under the pretext of delivering a sympathy note from the Ladies' Aid Society. A convenient fiction that Mrs. Blackwood, though visibly irritated, could not easily refuse. Mrs. Judith Blackwood received her in the same drawing-room, coldly elegant in black silk and pearls. Her manner was controlled, excessively so, and her lips were set in the faintest line of defiance. Such a terrible loss, Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Marple began gently. One cannot imagine how difficult it must be for you. Mrs. Blackwood inclined her head. My brother's health was never strong, Miss Marple. I fear the strain of recent months was simply too much. Said Miss Marple softly. And yet, I'm told he seemed quite vigorous at breakfast on the day of his death. Blackwood's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. Men of his temperament are unpredictable. My brother could be mercurial. Miss Marple nodded, as if that explained everything. I quite understand. And poor Clara, she must be very distressed. She is resting, Mrs. Blackwood said curtly. My niece is fragile. The Colonel's death has upset her greatly. There was an edge to her tone, a suggestion of control rather than compassion. Miss Marple, who had dealt with many grieving relatives, recognized the difference. Grief softens, guilt hardens. Do you happen to know, Miss Marple asked delicately, what business your brother was attending to on the evening before he died? I understand he was writing a letter. Mrs. Blackwood's fingers tightened ever so slightly around her teacup. Private matter, she said at last. Probably to his solicitor. Estate affairs, no doubt. How very sensible, Miss Marple said mildly. Though I did hear that part of the letter mentioned your name. Mrs. Blackwood froze, just for a heartbeat, then smiled thinly. Village gossip, Miss Marple. You know how people talk. Indeed I do, said Miss Marple. And I also know how seldom they talk without reason. The housekeeper's story. As she left the drawing-room, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Griggs, the housekeeper. A round, anxious woman with an apron perpetually dusted in flour, her hands twisted at her side as she whispered, I saw you come in, miss, and I wondered, do you think the Colonel's death was quite natural? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Why do you ask, my dear? Mrs. Griggs lowered her voice. Because he was afraid, miss. The night before it happened, he told me to lock all the doors. Said there were snakes in the grass, he did. Though what he meant, I couldn't say. Then, later that night, I heard voices from the study. Angry voices. I thought it best to keep out of it. Voices, Miss Marple repeated. Oohs. Mrs. Griggs hesitated. One was the Connells, the other, I can't be sure. Sounded like a woman's voice, low and sharp. Could have been Miss Clara, though I wouldn't swear to it. Did you see anyone leave? No, miss, but I heard the side door creak around 11. And the next morning, well, you know the rest. Miss Marple thanked her warmly and slipped a half-crown into her palm. As she walked away, her thoughts swirled. A frightened man, angry voices, a creaking door at 11, and a woman's voice. Yes, she thought. The puzzle was beginning to take shape. The solicitor's visit that afternoon. The village saw the arrival of a newcomer, Mr. Henry Alford, solicitor from Bath, a precise man with pince-nez spectacles and a habit of polishing them whenever questions grew uncomfortable. He was staying at the inn and, naturally, became the focus of attention at once. Miss Marple, who had an unerring instinct for timing, encountered him at the post office later that day. After a polite exchange about the weather, she said casually, I believe you were acquainted with Colonel Drake. Mr. Alford blinked. Indeed, he was my client, a difficult man, but fair. I understand he had some legal business with you before his death. The solicitor hesitated. Yes, though I can't discuss details. Of course, Miss Marple said kindly. But I am told he intended to alter his will. One so often hears of such things being delayed, sometimes fatally. Mr. Alford sighed. You are well informed, madam. Yes, the Colonel did write to me regarding his will, but I had not yet received formal instructions. He intended to make certain adjustments. To whose benefit, might one ask? To Miss Clara Drake, Alford said quietly. He was very fond of her despite their quarrels. Quarrels? Oh yes, over her fiancé, I believe, a young man the Colonel did not approve of. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How very predictable. And where might this young man be found? I believe his name is Gerald Linton, Alford said. An architect, currently working in London. The Colonel forbade him the house. Said Miss Marple softly. Forbidden fruit. Always the sweetest. An evening of reflection that night, as the rain turned to fog. Miss Marple sat in the parlour with Lavinia, the fire crackling cheerfully. On the small table beside her lay her knitting, untouched for once, and a notebook filled with neat, slanting handwriting. Lavinia, she said suddenly, do you happen to recall what time the church clock struck on the night of the Colonel's death? Lavinia looked puzzled. Oh dear, I don't. Why? Because Mrs. Griggs heard the side door creak at 11. Yet Sergeant Reeves mentioned that the Colonel's watch stopped when it fell. Read 10:15. That suggests he died before the door was opened. Lavinia frowned. Then whoever left at 11 was not the Colonel. Miss Marple finished softly. Precisely. She sat back, eyes glinting. Someone stayed behind after his death. The return of Clara Drake the next morning brought a surprise. Clara Drake herself appeared at Beechwood Cottage, pale and agitated, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag. Miss Marple, she said in a trembling voice, I don't know whom else to trust. I believe someone is following me. Following you? Miss Marple asked gently. How alarming. Tell me more. Clara sank into a chair. Since the funeral, strange things have been happening. I found my uncle's ring on my dressing table last night, the one he always wore. But it had been taken away by the police days ago. And this morning, someone slipped a note under my door. She handed it over. The note was written in bold, jagless, CLNC Sefi, SPANUAL gem. Lavinia gasped. Oh, how dreadful. Miss Marple examined the paper. Cheap stationery, ink smudged, but the writing firm. A hand used to authority. My dear, she said softly, have you told your aunt? Clara hesitated. No, Aunt Judith would only say I'm imagining things. Perhaps she would. Miss Marple murmured, and perhaps she would have reason to. Clara's eyes filled with tears. You think she knows something? I think, said Miss Marple, that everyone in that house knows something, but not everyone knows the same thing. An unexpected visitor later that afternoon. Sergeant Reeves arrived, looking harried. Miss Marple, I've had a letter from Scotland Yard. They're sending an inspector to review the case. Oh dear, Miss Marple said mildly. That does suggest they think it more than heart failure. Reeves scratched his head. They do, ma'am, especially after someone tried to break into the study last night. Miss Marple's needles stopped mid-click. Break in? Yes. The butler caught a shadowy figure near the window, bolted before he could see who it was. Nothing taken, but it's a queer business. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, especially since most people wouldn't risk entering a dead man's study, unless they believed something valuable had been left behind. Or something dangerous, Reeves added grimly. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. The secret in the study that evening, under cover of dusk, Miss Marple returned once more to Greystone Manor, with the sergeant's permission and the butler's reluctant assistance. Together they examined the study, this time more thoroughly. The fire grate had been cleaned, yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected a sliver of paper wedged between the hearth tiles. She retrieved it carefully with her crochet hook. It was the fragment of a letter, sinned at the edge, reading, "The war years were never meant to come to light. If Clara finds out." She folded it neatly into her handkerchief. "Well, well," she said softly, "the past has long shadows, doesn't it, Sergeant?" "What do you think it means, ma'am?" "That our colonel's death may be tied to something far older, and far more dangerous, than a quarrel over inheritance." A conversation with the butler. As they left the study, Miss Marple paused. "Tell me, Mr. Hargreaves, how long have you been in the colonel's service?" 20 years, ma'am," he said gravely, "since before the war." "Ah yes, the war," Miss Marple said. "I imagine it changed him." The butler's eyes clouded. "Indeed, he came back different, harder. There were rumors, of course, about things that happened in India during his command. But the colonel was a man of honor. Whatever burden he carried, he bore it alone. Until someone decided he shouldn't." Miss Marple murmured. The village tea room the next day. Miss Marple and Lavinia took tea at the Rose and Crown tea room, a favorite haunt for gossip and pastries. As they sipped their Earl Grey, Miss Marple overheard two women at the next table whispering. "Did you hear?" one said. "That young architect, Mr. Linton, was seen near the manor last week. He came by train from London." "Really?" the other replied. "After the colonel forbade him, bold of him." Miss Marple leaned toward Lavinia. "How very interesting," she said softly. "A lover's visit. Perhaps unannounced, perhaps unwelcome. Do you think he could have killed the colonel?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Lavinia, men rarely kill over money, but they often kill over love, or pride." A revelation at the church on Sunday morning. The village gathered for service at St. Mildred's Church. The vicar spoke on forgiveness, a theme that hung oddly heavy in the air. Miss Marple, however, spent less time on the sermon and more observing the congregation. Mrs. Blackwood sat rigidly in her pew, her gloved hands unmoving. Clara, pale and fragile, stared straight ahead, lips moving silently in prayer. The butler Hargreaves stood at the back, his eyes downcast. But when the hymn began, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Mrs. Blackwood glanced sharply toward the door just as it opened. A man had entered late, removing his hat. Young, well-dressed, with an anxious look. "Gerald Linton," Miss Marple whispered. "And about time too." The lover's confession. After service, she approached the young man as he stood awkwardly near the lich gate. "Mr. Linton, isn't it?" she said pleasantly. "Miss Marple, I believe you were acquainted with Miss Clara Drake." His eyes widened. Yes, I was." Is she well?" "As well as can be expected," Miss Marple said. "I hear you visited the manor recently." Linton flushed. "Only once. I had to see her. I thought her uncle might have changed his mind." "And did he?" "No, he ordered me out. Said if I came again, he'd expose something from my past. Some nonsense about forged papers during the war." "But I swear to you it wasn't true. I never—" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "My dear boy, calm yourself. The truth, you see, has a way of surfacing, even when buried under years of silence." He looked at her desperately. "You don't think I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that you've just given me a very important piece of the puzzle." Miss Marple's reflection. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting finally resumed. The rain had ceased, leaving the village hushed under a silver moon. Her mind turned over every fragment, a colonel with secrets from the war, a sister guarding something fiercely, a niece terrified yet holding back truth, a lover blackmailed, a burned letter. The pattern was forming. Death, she thought, often serves two purposes, to end one life and to save another. But whose life had been saved, and from what? She smiled faintly, setting down her needles. The heart may fail, she whispered, but guilt never does. Outside, in the quiet village of St. Mildred's, on the green, the church bell tolled midnight, and Miss Marple knew the real investigation had only just begun. I shouldn't say it, ma'am. Blackwood wasn't in her room at 10 that night. Oh, no ma'am. I brought her a letter. Came by the evening post. She'd already gone out. Out? Where to? I don't rightly know, ma'am, but when she came back, it was near 11. And her gloves were damp, as though she'd been outside. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Thank you, my dear, that's been most helpful. After Elsie left, Miss Marple turned to Lavinia. A woman who leaves her house at 10, returns at 11, and claims to have been in bed all the while is either a liar or a ghost. And ghosts, as I've found, are surprisingly rare. The ring and the note that evening. Miss Marple went to the manor again to check on Clara. The girl looked pale and exhausted, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple, she whispered, I found something else. She held out a small box. Inside lay a man's signet ring. The Connells, with the Drake crest engraved. I found it in my aunt's drawer, Clara said, but she told the police it had been taken by the coroner. Miss Marple took the ring, turning it thoughtfully in her hand. And this note, Clara added, handing her another scrap of paper, was tucked beneath it. The note read, in the Connells' handwriting, If you ever find this, Clara, know that what I did to protect you. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Oh my dear, your uncle may have been harsh, but he was not without conscience. The question is, what truth was he protecting you from? The stranger in the fog that night. The village was wrapped in fog so thick it swallowed sound. Miss Marple sat near the window, waiting. Her instincts told her something would happen, and instincts, in her experience, were rarely wrong. Sure enough, around midnight, she saw a shadowy figure moving near the path to Greystone Manor, cloaked, quick, deliberate. Without hesitation, she threw on her shawl, slipped into her sensible shoes, and followed. The figure paused at the side gate of the manor and slipped inside. Miss Marple crept after them, keeping to the hedgerow. From her vantage point, she saw the person enter through the study window, the same one that had been tampered with before. Minutes later, the light of a torch flickered inside. Then, a soft thud, followed by a cry. Miss Marple hurried forward just as Sergeant Reeves and Inspector Crayford arrived, alerted by a neighbor who'd seen the light. Inside, they found Mr. Hargreaves, the butler, sprawled beside the desk, dazed but alive. A small pistol lay near his hand. What on earth? Crayford began. Hargreaves moaned. I wasn't stealing, sir. I swear it. I only came for the letter. What letter? Miss Marple asked quietly. The one he wrote before he died. Hargreaves gasped. It was meant for Miss Clara. I burned it because Mrs. Blackwood ordered me to. But part of it was still in the drawer. I swear it. Crayford frowned. Why would she order that? Hargreaves trembled. Because it mentioned her husband. A hidden past. The next morning, Crayford and Miss Marple confronted Mrs. Blackwood with Hargreaves' confession. She sat very still, her hands clasped, eyes glittering with fury and something close to fear. My husband, she said coldly, died years ago. What of it? According to your brother's letter, Crayford said, your husband was caught, marshaled for espionage during the war, but the charge was covered up. Your brother took the blame to protect you and your child. Mrs. Blackwood's mask cracked for the first time. He promised he would never speak of it, she whispered. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Perhaps he meant to confess before his death, to free himself of guilt, not to harm you. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes blazed. He couldn't. If the truth came out, Clara's name would be ruined. My husband wasn't her father, Lionel was. The room fell silent. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. So Clara is your daughter, not your niece? Yes, Mrs. Blackwood said, trembling, and he wanted to tell her. He said secrets destroy families, but he didn't understand. I was protecting her. Crayford's tone was grim. You confronted him that night. I only meant to stop him, she said. He grew angry, shouted that he'd tell her regardless. I left him there, alive. When I came back later, he was dead. Miss Marple regarded her steadily. You returned to be sure the letter was gone, and Mrs. Blackwood's silence was answer enough. The red herring that evening, Crayford declared. It's clear enough. The shock of their quarrel killed him. She covered up the letter to hide the truth about her daughter. Case closed. But Miss Marple shook her head. Not quite, Inspector. It's tidy, and quite wrong. Crayford blinked. Wrong. Yes, Mrs. Blackwood may have quarrelled with him, but she didn't frighten him to death. There's something else. The Colonel's handwriting on that note to Clara. It trembled, yes, but not from age or illness, from fear. He wrote it after receiving something dreadful. What could be dreadful enough to kill a man like him? Crayford asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A letter, Inspector, from the dead. A visit to the vicarage the next morning. Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where the ever-curious Mrs. Denby poured out tea and gossip in equal measure. Did you hear, Miss Marple? Someone's been rummaging through the church records. Reverend says pages were torn from the baptism register. Indeed, Miss Marple said, eyes brightening. And what years were missing? Oh, around 1919, I believe. That would be just about when Clara was born, Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Denby frowned. Oh, but that makes no sense. The Colonel and his wife were abroad then. Miss Marple smiled. Yes. Which means someone else registered the child in secret. A revelation in the graveyard. That evening, Miss Marple walked through the misty churchyard. Her steps brought her to a small, weathered headstone tucked behind a yew tree. The inscription read Margaret Linton, 1896-1919, beloved wife of Thomas Linton. A name leapt at her. Linton. Gerald Linton's family. She knelt tracing the letters. Then it struck her. Linton. Gerald Linton, the young architect, the lover Clara's uncle despised. Oh, my dear boy, she whispered. You had no idea. The truth takes shape back at Beechwood Cottage. Miss Marple pieced it together aloud to Lavinia. Lionel Drake loved his sister once. Too much, perhaps. Her husband discovered the affair, and in a fit of despair, took his own life. To protect Judith and the child, Lionel took the blame, claiming her daughter as his niece. But someone found out. Someone who knew what really happened during the war and used it to blackmail him. You mean Mr. Linton? Lavinia gasped. No, Miss Marple said, not the young one. His father, Thomas Linton, who died soon after his wife. But the son never knew. The Colonel feared that if Clara married Gerald Linton, the truth would resurface. He tried to stop it, and someone decided to stop him instead. Lavinia stared. Then who? Miss Marple smiled faintly. The answer, my dear, lies in who had most to gain, and least to lose, from both the Colonel's death and Clara's silence. A sudden disappearance the next morning. The village was in uproar again. Clara Drake had vanished. Her bed was unslept in, her suitcase gone. A note left behind read simply, "Forgive me. I can't bear it any longer." Crayford groaned. She's fled, probably to London. The guilt's too much. But Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector. That note wasn't written by a girl in despair. It was written by someone who wanted us to think she was. What do you mean? The paper, Miss Marple said. Same cheap kind as the threatening note earlier. Clara's handwriting is neat and rounded. This is sharp and slanted. Someone has taken her. A dangerous discovery that afternoon. Miss Marple returned to the manor once more. The house was silent, too silent. She moved quietly through the corridors until she reached the cellar door slightly ajar. From below came the faintest sound, a muffled sob. She descended, candle in hand, and found Clara tied to a chair, pale but alive. Standing over her, startled by the sudden light, was Mrs. Griggs, the housekeeper. "Mrs. Griggs," Miss Marple said calmly. "What a remarkable choice of pastime." The woman's face twisted. "You shouldn't have come, Miss Marple." "I often shouldn't," Miss Marple replied, "and yet I do." The housekeeper's confession. Mrs. Griggs dropped the knife she'd been holding. "He ruined everything," she said bitterly. "The Colonel promised me security, after the war, when my husband was killed. But then he turned his back on me, said I wasn't respectable enough, and when I threatened to tell Clara who her real parents were, he laughed. So you frightened him," Miss Marple said softly. "I only wanted to scare him," Griggs sobbed. "I sent the letter, said the truth was coming out. He read it, clutched his chest, and fell. I didn't mean for him to die. And when you realized he was gone," Miss Marple finished gently, "you burned the letter. But not all of it." Mrs. Griggs nodded miserably. "I thought I'd be safe. But then that niece of his started asking questions, so I had to silence her too." A Crayford and Reeves burst in moments later, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier note of suspicion. Mrs. Griggs was taken away quietly, weeping. The truth revealed that evening, as calm returned to St. Mildred's, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire with Lavinia. "So it was the housekeeper all along," Lavinia said. "Not the sister, not the lover, but the servant." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "The simplest explanation, as always. A woman scorned, desperate to hold on to a secret too heavy for her conscience. Lavinia sighed. And the title? The Death That Saved a Life. What does it mean, Jane? Miss Marple smiled gently. Why, Lavinia, don't you see? The Colonel's death saved Clara's life. From blackmail, from shame, from living under the shadow of lies. Sometimes, she added, her eyes glimmering, it takes a death to restore truth, and truth is the only kind of life worth living. Outside, the bells of St. Mildred's tolled in the misty evening air, echoing through the village that would soon, as always, return to its peaceful illusion. Until the next secret stirred beneath its roses, the village restores its calm. Almost 3 days after Mrs. Griggs's arrest, the tranquil rhythm of St. Mildred's on the green began, tentatively, to return. The postman once more whistled down the lane, the vicar's wife resumed her church flowers, and the gossip at the tea shop shifted, ever so delicately, from death to decorum. Yet for all its outward serenity, something restless lingered in the air, like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was not at rest. She sat in her parlour that morning, knitting half-heartedly, her brow furrowed in thought. The matter was closed, according to Inspector Crayford. Mrs. Griggs had confessed, the evidence aligned, the village was content, and yet, Miss Marple had learned long ago that confessions, like gossip, were often only partly true. She murmured softly to herself, yes, she frightened him, that much is certain. But fear alone does not burn letters neatly, nor tie a young girl in a cellar with such precision. No, that smacks of planning, and Mrs. Griggs, she sighed, was never the planning sort. An unexpected visitor. At that very moment, there came a knock at her door. Quick, sharp, and anxious. Miss Marple looked up to see Clara Drake, pale as milk, standing in the doorway. Her eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness, but her voice trembled with purpose. I had to come, she said. Inspector Crayford told me not to trouble you, that it's all over, but it isn't, Miss Marple. I know it isn't. Miss Marple guided her gently to the armchair by the fire. Tell me, my dear, what troubles you? Clara's fingers twisted the hem of her handkerchief. I went through Aunt Judith's room this morning. I found something she'd hidden behind the drawer lining. A photograph. My uncle, and a man I've never seen before. On the back it said, to my truest friend, A.D., with gratitude. T.L. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A. Thomas Linton. No, Clara whispered. Look. She handed over the photograph. The face beside the Colonel's was strikingly familiar, fair-haired, aristocratic, but softened by years. Miss Marple blinked once. Anthony Denby, she said. Our dear vicar. The vicars passed that afternoon. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. The autumn light filtered through clouds as she walked up the gravel path. Reverend Denby, always mild and kind, looked surprised to see her. My dear Miss Marple, he said warmly, to what do I owe the pleasure? Oh, merely a small matter, she replied sweetly. I came across a photograph of you and the late Colonel, taken, I believe, many years ago. The colour drained from his face. Ah, he said after a pause, so that's come to light. You knew him well then? Very well, Denby admitted. During the war, we served together, though not officially. He was intelligence, I was chaplain to the 5th Regiment. We saw things, Miss Marple. Things better left buried. Miss Marple folded her hands. And yet, buried things have a nasty habit of surfacing, don't they? Denby's eyes clouded. He wrote to me, you know, before his death. Said he had done something unforgivable, that the truth must out, even if it destroyed him. I begged him to reconsider. I never heard from him again. Would you happen to have that letter? He looked down. I burned it. Miss Marple's expression softened. To protect him, to protect everyone, Denby said quietly. Some sins, Miss Marple, are not crimes of malice, merely of weakness. Yes, she said gently. And weakness, I find, is often more dangerous than wickedness. The puzzle in the fire that evening, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, staring into the flames. Clara's discovery had reopened too many questions. The vicar's involvement, Mrs. Blackwood's concealment, the Colonel's guilt. All threads in a tapestry whose pattern was nearly complete. But one piece remained stubbornly out of place: the letter. Mrs. Griggs had claimed she burned it. Hargreaves said he'd seen her do it. Yet a scrap of that same letter, half charred, had survived in the Colonel's desk. Miss Marple fetched it from her bureau, unfolded it carefully, and read once more the fragmentary words. Forgive me, the truth was hidden to spare her, the life of one must be weighed against another. She tapped her knitting needle against the armrest. The life of one must be weighed against another. Slowly, the old woman's eyes brightened. Oh, Lionel Drake, you clever, foolish man, that's what you meant. The manor revisited. The following morning, Miss Marple returned to Greystone Manor, where dust already gathered over the polished banisters. The estate felt hollow now, stripped of its bluster and pride. In the study, she found Inspector Crayford reading over his notes. You again, Miss Marple, he said, half amused, half exasperated. I'd thought you'd retired from this case. I don't retire, Inspector, she said. I merely paused to think. Crayford smiled. Very well, then, what thoughts brought you here? That you've arrested the wrong person. He blinked. Mrs. Griggs confessed! Yes, Miss Marple said calmly, to scaring him, but not to killing him. Crayford frowned. Are you saying it wasn't fright that killed him after all? Oh, it was fright, Miss Marple said. But not from Mrs. Griggs's letter, from something, or someone, much closer to home. The Colonel's last drink. She walked to the decanter, the one still standing on the table. You see this, Inspector? The Colonel was a creature of habit. Always poured his brandy himself. Precisely one finger's worth, no more. But on the night he died, the glass was filled to the brim. Crayford raised an eyebrow. A small detail. A significant one, Miss Marple corrected. He never would have overpoured, unless his hand was shaking. Which means he'd already been frightened before he took that drink. So you're saying? I'm saying, she said softly, that the letter wasn't what frightened him. It was the person who brought it. Crayford's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Griggs. No. Someone he trusted enough to receive privately. Someone who could walk into this study without question. Someone who'd been in this house often. Perhaps even that very evening. A quiet deduction that afternoon. Miss Marple invited all those connected with the case to gather in the manor's drawing room. Mrs. Blackwood, Clara, Inspector Crayford, Sergeant Reeves, and Reverend Denby. They sat uneasily, glancing between one another. The heavy drapes filtered the grey light, and the air carried a tension both polite and perilous. My friends, Miss Marple began, I fear we've all been quite mistaken. Mrs. Griggs's guilt is not the end of our story, merely its middle. The Colonel's death, you see, was both murder and mercy. Mrs. Blackwood stiffened. Murder and mercy. Yes, he was not poisoned, nor struck, nor coerced. He was frightened, deliberately, into heart failure. But the letter was only the trigger. The question is, who pulled it? Miss Marple looked toward the vicar. You, Reverend Denby. A murmur rippled through the room. Denby's face went pale. That's preposterous. Is it? Miss Marple said softly. You and he shared secrets from the war. Secrets you vowed to keep. When he decided to reveal them, you came to persuade him otherwise. You brought his own letter. The one you said you burned. To remind him of his sins. You never meant to kill him, only to frighten him into silence. Denby's eyes glistened. He swore he'd tell Clara the truth. He said the lie had lived too long. But if he'd spoken, it would have ruined her. And Judith too. He couldn't see that. He only saw his own conscience. So you frightened him, Miss Marple said gently. A man already burdened with guilt. You didn't mean to kill him, but you did. And then Mrs. Griggs, thinking herself clever, tried to conceal the evidence, never realizing she was protecting you. The confession. Denby bowed his head. You're right, he whispered. Every word. I visited him that night. I begged him to destroy the letter, to let the past stay buried. He refused. I took the letter, told him I'd burn it myself. But as I left, I heard him fall. I turned back. He was gone. I thought. He paused, eyes filled with anguish. I thought God had done what I could not. Crayford looked grim. You realize this is a confession, Reverend? Denby nodded. I know. I'll answer for it, here or beyond. Miss Marple's voice softened. He was a good man once, Mr. Denby. But good men have broken hearts, too. The letter restored days later. A curious envelope arrived at Beechwood Cottage, bearing no name. Only the words to be opened by Miss Marple. Inside was a page of careful handwriting, unsigned but unmistakably from Denby. It read, You were right, Miss Marple. There was mercy in his death. He lived with a secret that devoured him, and I, with another that chained me. I cannot undo what was done, but perhaps I can make one life free. Enclosed is the truth, Clara's true parentage, and the proof her name need not bear our sins. Within the letter was a second page, a birth certificate, altered years ago. The father's name, Lionel Drake. The mother's, Judith Blackwood. Miss Marple folded it gently, her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. The revelation to Clara that afternoon. Clara returned to Beechwood Cottage. She looked older somehow, the fear replaced by something more like peace. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I've had a letter from Mr. Denby. He said you helped him find courage to tell the truth. He's gone away, to a monastery in Kent." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, he's a man who seeks absolution in silence. Sometimes that's the best one can do." Clara hesitated. "He sent me this." She held out the birth certificate. "I know now who my parents were. I don't know what to feel." "Feel grateful, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You were loved, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps secretly, but loved nonetheless, and now, at last, you are free to live honestly." The Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You saved me, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, my dear. It was your uncle's death that saved your life. I merely helped you see it." A tea worth remembering. That evening, Miss Marple sat once again in her garden with Lavinia, as twilight turned the sky to lavender and rose. The kettle hissed softly, the birds called their last. "Well, Jane," Lavinia said, "you've done it again. Though I can't say I envy your mind. It must be exhausting, keeping so many secrets straight." Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh, my dear, life in the village is nothing but secrets. I simply try to untangle the ones that matter." "And this one?" Lavinia asked. "What shall you tell the inspector?" "The truth," Miss Marple said calmly, "though perhaps not the whole of it. The law is for deeds, not for hearts, and some punishments are best left to the conscience." Lavinia smiled. "You're far too wise for your own good." "Nonsense," Miss Marple replied, eyes twinkling. "I simply pay attention, the rest of the world does not." The church bell tolled 8. Miss Marple poured her tea, the cup clinking gently against its saucer. "Do you know, Lavinia," she said after a pause, "I rather think this village will be quiet now, for a time, until the next murder." Lavinia teased. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, let us hope not, but human nature being what it is." She left the sentence unfinished, the quiet of evening settling like a benediction. The winter dusk had fallen early upon St. Mary Mead, brushing the sky in violet and rose before surrendering to indigo. From the window of Gossington Hall, lamplight glowed upon the frost-streaked panes. Within, the drawing-room had been made ready, the fire burning, tea prepared, and Miss Marple seated, her knitting idle in her lap. Outside, the last guests were arriving at the inspector's request. The final gathering before the truth could be unveiled. A hush seemed to hover over the room, as though the very air knew the weight of what was about to be spoken. Colonel Denham stood stiffly near the fireplace, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Linton sat upon the edge of a chintz chair, her handkerchief twisted beyond recognition. Reverend Prowse, pale and gaunt, stood beside the tea trolley, the steam from the kettle ghosting his features, and Lady Ashcombe, that grande dame of measured words and formidable hats, perched with an air of forced composure upon the settee. Inspector Craddock, pen and notebook in hand, stood beside Miss Marple. "Thank you for coming," he began, his tone steady but respectful. "Miss Marple has been assisting in our inquiries. She has something to say, something which, I believe, will finally put this dreadful business to rest." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but carried a quiet authority, the gentle unraveling. "It is always remarkable," she began, "how sin cloaks itself in the ordinary. A cup of tea, a morning letter, a simple errand, and yet within such trivialities, lives are changed, and sometimes, ended." She looked up from her folded hands. "The death of poor Dr. Linton, as you all know, appeared at first to be a tragic accident, a fall, perhaps caused by his heart giving out. And indeed, that is what someone wished us to believe." Mrs. Linton gasped faintly. Lady Ashcombe's hand trembled, sending her brooch glinting in the lamplight. Miss Marple continued, "But from the first, I was struck by two details: the position of his body, and the expression upon his face. There was not merely shock but realization. The look of a man who, in his final seconds, understood something terrible." Inspector Craddock nodded subtly. "I began," Miss Marple went on, "to consider what could have driven such a realization. The letter he received that morning, for instance. A letter that disturbed him so greatly he tore it up almost at once. And yet, bits of it were found in the hearth." She turned her gaze toward Mrs. Linton. "My dear, you said you burned those pieces, but one scrap remained, just one. It bore the words, 'Your debt is not forgotten.'" Mrs. Linton went pale. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't. I don't believe you meant harm." Miss Marple said kindly, You wished to protect your husband's reputation. I understand that. But you must see, it was precisely that letter which frightened him. The shadow of Det Colonel Denham stepped forward. You're suggesting blackmail, Miss Marple. In a manner of speaking, she replied, but not quite in the usual way. The debt mentioned was not financial. It was moral. A murmur ran through the room. Miss Marple's eyes rested upon Reverend Prowse. Reverend, you served as chaplain during the war, did you not? You would know the burden of men's souls when faced with death. The Reverend looked startled. Yes indeed, but what has that to do with Dr. Linton's conscience? Miss Marple said gently. You see, many years ago, during his time at the military hospital in Surrey, Dr. Linton made a grievous mistake. One that cost a man his life, a private named Harold Denham. Colonel Denham froze, his color draining. My brother, he breathed. Miss Marple nodded. Quite so. The report was sealed, of course. War records often are. But someone else knew. Someone who stood to gain by unearthing that secret at precisely the right moment. Her eyes shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward Lady Ashcombe. The old woman stiffened. You cannot possibly. Oh, but I can, Miss Marple said softly. You see, Lady Ashcombe, you were very fond of Dr. Linton, but when he refused to perform that, shall we call it unethical, operation upon your goddaughter's fiancé, you turned quite bitter. The fiancé, as you told me, was not worth saving, and yet, you wanted him saved, to preserve the family's reputation. Dr. Linton would not be swayed. Lady Ashcombe's face hardened, the mask of gentility slipping. You dare accuse me of blackmail? Yes, Miss Marple finished gently. You wrote the letter knowing it would frighten him. You never intended to kill him, I dare say, but you wanted him to yield, to do your bidding. And when he did not, you went to confront him that evening. Inspector Craddock spoke quietly. And what happened then, Miss Marple? The scene at the cliff. Miss Marple's eyes softened, her voice taking on a reflective calm. They met at the edge of the cliff, near the old stone stile, the same spot where his body was found. She pleaded, he refused. Harsh words were spoken. And then, tragedy, a shove perhaps, not even meant to harm, and he fell. Lady Ashcombe's lips trembled. I didn't push him. I tried to pull him back. Yes, Miss Marple said kindly. That, I believe, you tried to save him. But by then, it was too late. The older woman's face crumpled, and she buried it in her gloved hands. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows upon the walls. Craddock approached gently, placing a steadying hand on Lady Ashcombe's shoulder. I'm afraid you'll need to come with us, my lady. We'll take your statement. She nodded faintly, her composure shattered, her grandeur gone. The death that saved a life. As the inspector led Lady Ashcombe from the room, Miss Marple remained seated, gazing into the fire. The others stood in uneasy silence. It was Mrs. Linton who finally spoke, her voice trembling. So, it was all an accident. Miss Marple gave a small, wistful smile. Perhaps not an accident, but a consequence. You see, Linton, your husband's death, though tragic, has spared another life. Mrs. Linton blinked in confusion. Whatever do you mean? The young woman, Miss Emily Ashcombe, Miss Marple said softly. The one for whom Lady Ashcombe wished to secure a marriage. That man, Mr. Phelps, would have ruined her utterly. His debts, his associations, all vile. Dr. Linton's refusal saved her from that fate. There was a long pause. Reverend Prowse bowed his head. The death that saved a life, he murmured. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and to the end, it will save another yet. Lady Ashcombe will have much to answer for. But repentance can be its own kind of redemption. A village restored a week later. The winter fog had lifted from St. Mary Mead. The bells of St. Catherine's chimed gently through the clear air. In the village square, life had resumed its comforting rhythm. Mrs. Bantry gossiping at the post office, Mr. Weatherby tending his roses, and the vicar's wife collecting for the parish fund. At her cottage on the lane, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, a tray of scones beside her and a letter upon her lap. It was from Inspector Craddock. My dear Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough for your assistance. Lady Ashcombe has confessed, confirming your account almost entirely. It seems her guilt has lifted a heavy burden from her. She is strangely at peace. Mrs. Linton has decided to remain in the village, and has already offered her services at the local infirmary. I dare say she will find purpose there. Yours ever, Dermot Craddock. Miss Marple smiled faintly and folded the letter away. Outside, the church clock struck noon. She poured herself another cup of tea, her hand steady despite her years. People, she murmured to herself, Hair so curious, they so often think salvation comes from great acts. Yet it is through sorrow that many find grace. She looked out through the lace curtains. Beyond the garden gate, children ran, laughing in the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the baker's. Life, dear unto thee, persistent life, went on. Epilogue. The reflection that evening, as twilight fell once more, Miss Marple took up her knitting. Her needles clicked softly in the fading light, a rhythm as timeless as her thoughts. She considered the curious circle of human hearts, how pride breeds deceit, how fear gives birth to desperate acts, and yet how truth, once spoken, brings healing. Dr. Linton's death had torn through the quiet calm of the village, yet it had mended more lives than it had broken. Emily Ashcombe was safe, Mrs. Linton was reborn through service, even Connell Denham, once so bitter, had found forgiveness for a long-forgotten wrong. Miss Marple smiled gently. God works, she said softly, in the most mysterious ways. And as the fire crackled low, she added, almost to herself, sometimes even through death, comes life.